After the Cold War ended in the late 20th century, the Americans unearthed a terrifying discovery. They had always prided themselves on being capable of taking on the Russian armored hordes with their assumed technological superiority. However, declassified documents and intelligence reports in the 1990s painted a totally different picture, completely shattering those predictions. The findings were shocking, not only because they altered the perceived balance of power, but also because they highlighted significant intelligence gaps. But to understand why their findings were so chilling, we have to go back and start off with the initial perspectives from both sides during the rise of the tensions of the Cold War. Far from just being a political standoff between two clashing ideologies, the decades of riveting events during the 1940s to the early 1990s could be ultimately outlined as a high-stakes arms race between the USA and the Soviet Union. Behind iron curtains and massive walls, boundaries of military technology were pushed by these superpowers to give their war machines the most lethal capabilities and invincibility. It can be said that the battle tank stands at the vanguard of this conflict, being a main offensive weapon in frontline land combat. Battle tanks play crucial roles in providing heavy firepower, strong armor, and mobility on the battlefield. Any technological advancement becomes decisive in securing their place as symbols of military might and strategic superiority. On one side of the competition in tank production is the United States and NATO, armed with superior technology and a focus on combined arms tactics. U.S. tanks were reputed to have excellently integrated operations with the infantry, artillery, and air support. On the other end, the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact were masters of mass mobilization and rapid deployment. Their mass production led to batteries of steel giants in the battlefront that by 1988, the U.S. government estimated the enemy's tanks to be around 52,000 compared to NATO's 20,000. That's a massive difference, and NATO had every right to be worried at those odds. Models like the US M1 Abrams and the Soviet T-72 exemplified the technological rivalry, each designed to dominate the battlefield in its own way. Constantly, these tanks would see modifications, and newer models would also be taking battle stations. Cold War history is loaded with showdowns between US and Soviet tanks, if not direct battles, then by their proxies in Africa, the Middle East, and elsewhere. But in Central Europe, these tanks were hauled to the front lines, ready to strike at the first sign of a hostile act. On the surface, Soviet tanks outnumber their rivals by 2.5 to 1. With sheer numbers, the Soviets could afford to lose some of their force to punch a hole in the US defense and penetrate the front line. However, this numerical comparison does not consider that several Soviet tanks were unavailable for battle in Central Europe. Of the 52,000 Soviet tanks, 17,000 had to be deployed along the Chinese border, and another 5,000 in Central Asia to cope with the areas of instability like Afghanistan and Iran. That leaves around 30,000 tanks on the Central European front versus 20,000 of NATO's. The ratio goes down from 2.5 to 1 to 1.5 to 1. If France fully integrates its 1,500 tanks into NATO, the odds will grow shorter still. Add to the factor other Soviet logistical disadvantages, particularly in transporting their tanks. This adds to the list of handicaps of Soviet tanks. More importantly, quality comes into play. While the Soviets have closed the gap in terms of powerful main guns, these have not reached the high degree of precision their US rivals have. Soviet tank systems did not have the capabilities of night vision, laser rangefinders, ballistic computers, and stabilizers, to name a few. Other diminishing factors that the US and NATO see in their enemies are the design and engines of the tanks that counteract the supposed numerical advantage. These tanks are not highly sophisticated, have cramped interiors, unshielded fuel cargo, and run on inferior engines. These factors help reduce the so-called tank gap to a ratio of 1.5 to 1 in favor of the Soviets. Some Western analysts even asserted that specifically in Central Europe, US NATO could be superior by 1.22 to 1 when taking those metrics into account. It's hard to really say with such unreliable variables. However, Pentagon analysts believe the Soviets could still win, even with the odds of 1.5 to 1. This is achieved by concentrating forces on the main point of attack and obtaining a massive local advantage. So, as you can see, battlefield situations were constantly changing. There had to be a better way to tilt the odds. To promptly adapt, both sides undertook substantial investments in tank armor and protection. At the heart of these armors was the traditional rolled homogeneous armor, or RHA, a solid steel component that served as the foundation of tank defense. Steel, ceramic, and plastic were used to create composite armor layers, which improved protection against chemical energy projectiles, like heat rounds, and kinetic energy rounds, like the armor-piercing, fin-stabilized discarding sabot rounds. Another innovation was spaced armor, which has several layers and air spaces to deflect incoming missiles before they can penetrate the primary armor. Then came explosive reactive armor, or ERA, a game-changer in tank defense. ERA consists of explosive tiles that react upon impact, disrupting incoming rounds and reducing their effectiveness. Imagine a layer of armor that fights back. ERAs are like two plates of metal sandwiching an explosive filler. When struck, the explosives in ERA tiles detonate outward, deflecting and dissipating the kinetic energy of the incoming missile. An early example is Israel's Blaze ERA, which adds significant protection of around 350 to 400 millimeters of RHA equivalent, without compromising mobility. In the Soviet Union, ERA saw rapid evolution with Contact 1 and its successor, Contact 5. As an upgrade from Contact 1, the upper side of Contact 5 is made of much thicker steel. They contain one or two 4S22 reactive elements, depending on the module. A 4S22 elements explosive has 330 grams of TNT equivalent. It is so sensitive that it bursts even when hit by missiles that penetrate armor. These systems enhanced base armor protection by up to 160%, making Soviet tanks formidable on the battlefield. But how good really were the Soviet ERAs, particularly the Contact 5? In 1997, years after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the Soviets left behind some equipment and vehicles in East Germany. Of those were multiple battle tanks, mostly T-72s to be exact. So realizing the prize and potential use of these, US and German analysts quickly snatched them to observe them and conduct some tests. The main tests they would conduct were ballistic tests. Basically, a live fire test, using the tanks as targets to find vulnerabilities or weak spots. After all of the analysis conducted by strategists and military experts, they would finally have some solid concrete answers that could give some credibility to their estimates if a war had kicked along the German border. Now, these were not just normal T-72s that they set up on the range. These were fitted with explosive reactive armor, Contact 5 to be exact. But how good really was the Soviet ERA, particularly the Contact 5? The tests would soon provide that answer. The targets, 25 Soviet tanks equipped with Contact 5 heavy ERA and composite armor, particularly the T-72A1 and T-72B1. The test began with the M1 Abrams firing off rounds commonly used during the Cold War. The menu of anti-tank projectiles consists of depleted uranium penetrators and sabot rounds. Next was the A-10 Thunderbolt II with its monstrous 30mm GAU-8 Avenger cannon. After that was a 30mm gun of the AH-64 Apache attack helicopter. And then finally, a range of standard NATO anti-tank guided missiles. In other words, these tanks were about to be obliterated. And just as they predicted, the Soviet T-72s were reduced into a smoldering wreckage of burning metal. Just kidding. After the smoke cleared, the tests revealed an unsettling reality. The Soviet tanks were totally unfazed by the meteor shower of lead and fire. Even with an array of US and NATO projectiles hurled at them, there was absolutely no penetration or substantial destruction inflicted upon any of the Soviet tanks downrange. The tests were well documented by the reputable publication Jane's International Defense Review. With this revelation, a big question intrigued the Cold War architects and aficionados. Could Soviet tanks have been relatively impenetrable during the Cold War? It leaves a lot more questions than answers to the ratio of odds many strategists were coming up with at the time. The incongruity of the results, compared to the calculations and predictions meticulously written up by the war analysts, now shattered preconceived notions of NATO's capabilities, prompting a re-evaluation of tactical and strategic doctrines that had been considered reliable for decades. How would history be altered had the T-72s and other tanks known that they were lethal fortresses on the battlefield and pushed beyond their limits in the proxy wars in Africa and elsewhere? How would the outnumbered NATO tanks in East Germany have closed in their ranks had the Soviet tank regiments breached enemy lines? Could the dreaded Fulda Gap conflict finally have become a real battle? I think the West would have been in for a nasty surprise had the Cold War gone hot any time in the 80s. Certainly, the combination of mass mobilization, rapid deployment tactics, and advanced ERA tipped the scales in the Soviets' favor. What are your thoughts on these findings?